Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Whatever the I Want podcast, where I, your host, Gabby, get to talk about whatever the I want. And today's episode is going to be about leaving the past in the past. So I want to start off today's episode by reading from the book Simple Abundance. It was actually today's reading that inspired this episode. Sometimes a person has to go back, really back, to have a sense and understanding of all that's gone to make them before they can go forward. Polly Marshall. So they basically talk about how we have to do a deep dig, like an archaeological dig on our lives. And how basically as you dig, you unearth these mosaics, which basically are these multicolored chips that help you create a larger visual representation of your life. Each mosaic will tell sacred stories about your life and things that have mattered to you, people, things that are important, and it will reveal glimpses of your past. And it will also show us what moments brought us happiness and contentment in our past lives. So when recalling our past, there's times where we can recall moments like clear as day. And there are other times where other memories are a little bit blurry, or they even have gaps. And so they were saying that when this happens, we need to be patient as we brush away the sediment of the past. What we're searching for is for a pattern of personal, authentic pleasures and preferences. So in what she's referring to is basically looking towards your past to help you figure out who you're meant to be. So for example, my parents told me that when I was a kid, I loved being in front of a camera, that whenever a camera was pointed my way, I had a pose. I was putting my shoulder to the side, I would be smiling. And so whenever I asked them, are you at all surprised that content creation is something that I want to pursue? They weren't shocked because they said I had always been this way. I always loved being in front of a camera, and that's just the way it was. And so I do think that whenever we are looking to our past, it can help us discover things about ourselves, but it's also so important not to live in the past. Like, for example, if you are an athlete who had a major injury and now you aren't able to play in the league that you were in, and you could sit here and wallow about it and just think about the good old times when you were able to be physically playing, or you can look to the future. What are you able to do now? What has that injury taught you? Are you able to help other people during their physical rehabilitation? Are you now a coach? What are some ways that you can still incorporate your love for the game while not being able physically to play it? I also think that it's so important that whenever we are looking to our past and we are unearthing those parts of ourselves that we've hidden so deep down and that we've tried to forget, that we realize why it is that we have been avoiding it. Because I do think that a big part of the healing journey is discovering who you are underneath all this, right? Like at the surface, you all see who I am now or who I portray myself to be, but you don't necessarily see all the pain that I've experienced, all the hurt that I've experienced, different situations that I've been put in. And that's not necessarily anybody else's business to know. Obviously, if you want to share those experiences, there's a community of people who will talk about it. I guarantee you there's probably a Reddit page of survivors of whatever it is that you've experienced. And, communities, even when it comes to group therapy. So obviously you can do a lot of this work on your own, and you do that by reflecting, really digging deep, and you need to dedicate time towards this. It's not like it's 5 minutes a day. It's like, oh no, I need to spend an hour trying to remember what it is that I had experienced. What is it that I had blurred out or that I had tried to forget about. And I think I've personally wanted to do hypnotherapy. I feel like I've kind of brought to the surface all that, for the most part, has needed to be brought up. I do still think I have some blockages that I'm currently going through, but I do think that for the most part, I am like pretty healed. I remember certain things that would trigger me would be like intimate scenes on like movies or like TV shows and stuff. Like that was something that would be triggering for me. And I just remember like having really heightened emotions, being very emotional, and honestly like angry and really frustrated. And that's just something that would trigger me. But obviously I know that everybody else has different triggers. And so even car accidents, that's something that can really trigger me when it comes to watching movies and consuming media. Whenever it's just something that I'm not expecting to see, or I have to like close my eyes and look away. It's just not something that I'm entirely comfortable watching. Those are just scenes that are just hard for me to view. And I think that a big reason why a lot of our parents, a lot of our family members can be so like uptight or judgmental is because they continue to judge themselves based off of previous scenarios that they've been through. I remember recently my mom opened up to my sister and I about a situation that she had experienced that was very traumatizing. And I had no idea that she had gone through something like that. And it's not something that I think the majority of people have ever experienced. And it was just crazy to think that, you know, my mom's in her mid to late 50s. And it's like, wow, like she's carried this in all this time. And I asked her, like, did you ever talk about it? Did you ever report it? Did you like, you know, trying to gauge the situation? And she's like, Gabby, like that wasn't a thing back then. And if it was a thing back then, like people weren't necessarily taken seriously, or they just didn't have the technology to be able to like, you know, put out information as fast as possible to help catch people who are committing, you know, these terrible crimes. But at the same time, let's just talk about how like the statute of limitations is like complete and utter bullshit. It should not by law limit the time frame of when a victim can come up and talk about something. Like that is so ridiculous to think about, that like once I finally have the courage to say something about something, like this person can just walk away all because I took a day longer to talk about this, a year longer. You know, everybody processes information at very different rates, and sometimes people aren't willing to have that conversation. I recently asked one of my cousins within the past year, I asked them like, hey, do you think that XYZ happened to you when you were younger? Because it was going to help me have more of an understanding of like things that have happened to me in my past. And she like completely denied the situation, was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and blah, blah, blah. And I remember asking my sister like, hey, what do you think about the situation? Because she was there. She's like, honestly, I think that person's just not open to processing that right now. You know, there's some people who go their entire lives without processing things that have ever happened to them. And for me, it's like, I'm trying to fill in every single puzzle piece, you know, like I see a big picture of who I am, but there's just these tiny little pieces of myself that are missing, that I know that like through family members, through friends, other people who were like in similar situations as me, or even maybe in the same room as me, like will help me like fill in those puzzle pieces. As of right now, I feel like the gaps are much smaller. I do think that I have a general idea of my past, but I do think that, you know, I really thought it was normal for a lot of people to have like gaps in their childhood. You know, I really thought that was normal, and it's not. It's not normal. A lot of people remember vividly their childhood, and, you know, obviously like we're not going to go into details about things that have happened, but obviously you can assume one thing or another. But I'm sure we will go over some of that stuff in a future episode. But basically, when you're uncovering the past, you don't want to also live in the past. Obviously, you're not going to get an apology from a lot of people. You know, you're not going to get an apology of like, hey, Gabby, sorry I spanked you whenever you were a kid. Like, you know, I had to have a lot of difficult conversations with my parents because obviously, you know, they're not perfect. I'm not perfect. And obviously parenting was a lot different back then. And I have a lot more sympathy towards my parents, because obviously I'm not a parent. I don't know what it's like to have a kid. I don't know what it's like to be working a full-time job, to come home, to have to cook dinner, to like, what if I had a long day at work, you know, like to snap on somebody. And, you know, I know that I can't go back, and neither can anybody in my life go back and rewrite these scenarios. But what we can do is move forward from them. And again, you might not get an apology from a lot of these people who have hurt you in your past, but it's about understanding that, like, okay, this is what happened, and I don't have to live in that anymore. You know, I can let that piece of me go. Obviously, you're never going to forget. You're not going to forget these things that happened to you, no matter how hard you try. But it's about acknowledging, console that part of you, that 8-year-old you, that 15-year-old you, that 24-year-old you that went through these experiences. Console that version of you. Show them love. Show them that you are here for them, and have a self-care day. Cry about it. I think that crying can be one of the most healing things that a human can experience. And I don't know why there's just such a big stigma about being emotional. I remember my brothers growing up would be like, you know, they'd accidentally hit me, or, you know, I don't know a situation in which this happened, but it would happen a lot. They'd be like, what are you going to do, Gabby? Cry about it? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm going to do. And then like, I'd end up like crying uncontrollably. And I used to have a lot of shame about being emotional, because I grew up with 2 older brothers, that they made me feel guilty for having big feelings. And I didn't know how to process these big feelings, you know, especially because like my mom's emotional, but she was not the most sympathetic person growing up. You know, it would be a lot of those situations of like you'll get over it, like you're fine. You know, she had to wear the hat of being a mother and a father at the same time. Not that my dad was not there. He was there, but like he was working a lot. And I think a lot of people who come from, you know, first generations, they experience a lot of that, of where their parents are working a lot, and you might have one parent take on multiple roles while the other one is trying to provide financially. So, you know, I have forgiven, you know, my parents for, you know, these situations and things that have impacted me. But I mean, obviously, like, even if you see now, like I am, it does make me emotional. That doesn't mean that you forget these things. You know, they're still a part of you. You know, they make you regardless of how good or bad or awful or amazing these experiences are, you know. I could sit here and resent people, but I choose not to. And I encourage you not to live in resentment, not to live in negativity, and not to live in the past, because the past will always remain just that. But what you can change is the future. What you can change is how you approach situations. You know, like I definitely think that whenever I have a child, I'm going to be more empathetic, because obviously I'm an emotional being. I'm super emotional, very sensitive, that whenever I see them crying, I'll be able to approach the situation entirely different, because I know what it's like. It's like when somebody's getting bullied, right? Somebody who's getting bullied can decide, oh, I'm going to be a bully because people were bullies to me. Or I'm going to befriend the person who's getting bullied, or I'm going to stand up for them. So when it comes to digging up these pieces of your past, you have to learn to let go. Easier said than done, way easier said than done. I do think it takes years first figuring out what exactly happened to you. You know, maybe going through the details, you know, verifying things with people if there were witnesses. And also it takes time to just like, again, it's almost like grieving. You have to like assess the situation accept it for what it is. And, there's going to be pain. There's going to be tears. There's going to be a lot of mixed emotions. Like, why me? What did I do to deserve this? It's all my fault. I think also women can be blamed a lot because of what they're wearing, although what you're wearing has absolutely zero to do with whether or not somebody has horrific intentions. I think a lot of blame can be put onto women for a lot of things that happen to them, when in reality, it is not our fault at all. It is never the victim's fault. And I want to really reiterate that, like, what has happened to you is not your fault at all. And all that you can do moving forward is to, whether or not you want to forgive somebody, that's up to you. I cannot decide that for you. But I do recommend or suggest to eventually just let go. Don't live in the past. Don't live in this victim mentality of like, well, that happened to me, so horrible things happened to me. Well, that happened to me, so I can never have a healthy relationship. Oh, well, I have a pattern of toxic relationships, so I will never find somebody who can understand me or who has the patience to have difficult conversations with me. That will never happen. If you continue to write that narrative in your head, then sure, it will play itself out. But you have to realize that you went through these terrible things and they made you who you are. They shaped you. That doesn't make those experiences okay, but it is a part of you. It is a part of your story, but it's not your whole story. It's not. Again, console those parts of you that have experienced these things. And if you are currently experiencing a toxic relationship or anything that feels wrong, leave it. Leave it. I left a toxic job that I was at a year ago. It might be almost a year to the day. I remember putting in my 2 weeks notice and my boss was like, no, I don't even want 2 weeks. You'll have to the end of the week. And I remember quitting on a Wednesday. And then that Friday I was let go. And they were like, oh, by the way, so why don't you finish up work for like the rest of the month? Like, it was that toxic of a work relationship that it was like overworked, underpaid. And then on top of that, after I quit, because of this high state of stress they were constantly putting me in, I was very anxious. This is a work from home job. Why am I having anxiety for a work from home job? Like, this is crazy. And yeah, they're like, can you finish out the work for the rest of the month? It's like, honey, we have a few weeks left in February. You're only paying me up until this point, yet you want for me to do even more work. And I'm a fast worker. And they're like, oh, are you able to do all of March too? Or like April, May? Like, can you get all of the content as much as possible done for us? And I'm like, me being who I am, I still completed the work up until the end of February because I'm just a good person. I don't think the majority of people would do that. I'm not saying that the majority of people are bad people, but I just think people are like, no, you pay me for what you pay me for these hours. And so I'm going to do what I do in those hours. And I still ended up working up until end of February, at least in terms of like scheduling out content, because it was a social media job. But I was like, oh my gosh, the job made me want to pull my hair out. Like, I felt so stressed. And I worked at that job, I believe, for 2 years, maybe 2.5. And down to like the very first call that I ever had with my boss, it was a Zoom call, and the person who hired me was also on the call. She was overlooking. At that point, it was supposed to be a social media team of 2. And not long after, so hold on, back to the call. My first call, work meeting, they're arguing with each other. I mean, straight up arguing about who our audience is. Who are our consumers? Are they men? Are they women? Are they queer? Do they have long hair? Do they have short hair? What do they look like? So they were literally arguing. And I mean, I felt so uncomfortable. And that was my first tell sign of like girl, you don't need the money that bad. And I stayed in that job, for 2.5 years. 2.5, 2024. Oh, yeah, I would say like 2 years, maybe a year and a half. I started working there in 2022. I quit 2024. So I think maybe it was a year and a half, 2 years. That doesn't really matter. But the point is like, I knew that this was something so incredibly toxic from the get-go. And I stayed that long, and it took for things to get so bad for me to quit. And I remember for a while, I would like look up their social media, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, how are they doing? You know, what's life like without me? You know, it's like that toxic relationship of like, I'm still going to check up on you. Cause it is kind of like a breakup, like quitting a job, leaving a job, getting let go. Like those are all like breakups. And so I'm like, oh, like, what does their social media look like without me? What are they up to or whatever? And I had to tell myself to stop looking at it because it just wasn't healthy, because that was me living in the past. Why am I sitting here checking up on them? They didn't give a fuck about me when I worked for them. They didn't give an actual fuck about me. And here I am like spending 5 minutes looking at their social media, checking up on them. For what? That's me living in the past. The past is in the past. If I was meant to still have that job, I would have had it. They would have treated me properly. They would have paid me fairly, and I would still be working there. But no, that's not the case. It took for them to like push me back against the wall for me to be like, I'm done. What more do you want from me? Like literally sucking you dry is what it felt like. And I'm so happy that I quit. It was very hard on me. I remember how anxious I felt after I had been wanting to quit for a while, but I mean, it just kept getting progressively worse. And the micromanaging was, I mean, like, I felt like I was being choked to the point where like my brain was going to explode from all the squeezing. And I had to learn to like, let it be. I did what I needed to do, and that job did what it needed to do for me. And ultimately it eventually pushed me to create this podcast. And so it's like, even in those terrible moments, there can be some light. You know, these things can teach you or inspire you to do other things. Like I saw a video of a woman who went to a museum, who saw a piece of art about I believe it was of the slave trade. And it was of these boats underneath the ocean that were used during the slave trade. And they had black scuba divers, I believe it was scuba divers. And they would go into the ocean and help find these shipwrecks. And that inspired her to then like learn the history about slave ships. And, you know, eventually she's like, I didn't think about my ancestors and how we came to the States, like that whole story being a part of it. And so it's just so crazy how everything can connect from one thing to another, and how one thing can propel you forward. And don't allow the past to define you. Obviously, I don't know absolutely anything that you've gone through. Only you know those things. But again, talk to somebody, talk to your friends, talk to a therapist, journal it out. Talking about your feelings not only helps you process them, but it can also help encourage other people to talk about their situations as well. So it is in a way like the most selfless thing that you can do, because it's so healing for yourself, but it can also help heal other people. And that's why I think this podcast is so successful, because it encourages me to be vulnerable, but it also gives people the space to know and to understand that there is beauty in vulnerability, that no one can take this away from me. These are things that I choose to share, things that I choose to talk about, and it's going to resonate with whoever it's meant to resonate with. With that being said, leave the past in the past, no matter how hard it may be, No matter how long it takes you, don't beat yourself up if you feel like the situation happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and you're like, why am I not over it yet? There is no time frame when it comes to healing from anything that you've ever gone through. Even if you're going through a divorce, there's not like oh, well, I was only married to them for 2 years, so it shouldn't hurt that bad, right? Like, I should just be over it. And it's like, no, pain is pain. Suffering is suffering. There's no Band-Aid. There's no medication to healing yourself. It's just about being patient. Be patient with yourself. Be kind to yourself. Treat yourself as if you would a friend. You would console your friend. You wouldn't be like, get up and get the fuck over it. At least I would hope not, because I don't know if I'd want to be your friend if you would talk to me like that. I'd probably just cry, honestly. Be kind to yourself and hope that you spend some time today excavating those mosaic pieces that you have that make you who you are and ultimately don't define you. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. I trust that you will like this video and subscribe to the podcast. Catch you in the next one.